So Emily, I know you can't see this piece of paper given to me by Cassie. On it is a poem by this man named Baba Taher. Yeah. That's the best I can do with this translation. Um, Jackie, it's okay if we talk about this a little? So before I actually translate and make some childish commentary, let me just say a couple of things about the culture itself, and then I don't know how true it is that biologists and sociologists argue that because our ancestors had to go out there and destroy things, kill life in order to survive, this violence just lives inside us as part of our DNA because of our past. Life happened to be quite brutal, quite vicious, and it keeps repeating itself over and over and over again. And so, I don't know how true it is, but if it is true, it explains, why we behave the way we do sometimes, or quite often, when the moral codes and social codes kind of disappear. The Persian culture, for many hundreds of years, it had been crushed by various powers, whether it's the Greeks, Rome, the Turks, the Afghanis, the Arabs, and then the last few centuries, the West, and it's kind of like when someone suffers one traumatic event after another, it's very difficult for that person to have this thing called happiness or joy and optimism live inside them. It's just not possible. You're going to look at everything with a good amount of skepticism, and it just becomes part of your DNA. There is no escape from it. And to some extent, it could even be leaked into the idea of racism, or the fact of racism, that when you have a certain person of color who kind of reads their history and comes to realize that, every other day someone who happens to be in their color gets assaulted, after many, many centuries of this thing happening as part of your DNA, you internalize it. And this is important because I think if you're a Westerner, and this is not about, us sitting here, just some general comment, and it may be completely false, I don't know. If you happen to, say, not be from that part of the world and not have experienced those things, it means that for the most part your DNA is lacking those components that create certain brain chemistry, create certain perspectives, create certain emotions inside you. And so when you read these poems, they sound very exotic, they sound interesting, they sound inspiring, even spiritual, if you want to use that word. But For the most part, it remains very superficial for you. So when we speak of someone like Rumi, like Sa'di, like Hafiz, like Baba Taher, you need to understand that these people come from a culture that has been kind of suffering traumatic events, every few years. And so you don't find literature that's optimistic about life, about people, about marriage, about children. And so when someone says, I've gone to school, no one really cares. I mean, it's great that you've gone to school, but because of the cultural experience, in as much as it is valued, it is also dismissed quickly. When someone says, I have a lot of money, and that signifies power, within the context of the culture, even the money can buy you reputation and perhaps, a lot of prestige in society. In the long run, it doesn't do much for you. People have a tendency of basically devaluing everything and anything. So Baba Taher comes from this rather gloomy perspective that forces people to kind of think and reflect and be bleak and pessimistic. And so when physical life has not too much to offer you, naturally you kind of turn towards the heavens. I don't know if God is real or not. I don't know if people have a soul. None of those things really matter. Because I know, in the 21st century, these debates can be exciting, interesting, exotic at the same time, quite tiring and ridiculous. And so naturally your kind of, your outlook on life becomes a bit more abstract towards things that, are not very grounded. Around the 12th century, there were a group of people in Iran, namely Hamadan, and they were called the Babas, and Baba basically means father. And they were ascetics, they wouldn't mingle with people. And whatever it is that they did, it was meant to kind of purify them from within. And so one day there was this 12-year-old kid in the midst of them as the elder of this community was giving a sermon. And this 12-year-old asks the elder, that how can he kind of figure out what truth is, if there is a way he could experience God. And sarcastically, this old man looks at this kid and says, well, if you were to go, and Hamadan happens to be very cold during winter time, freezing temperature. So he looks at this kid and he says, there is an easy way to reach truth and to experience God. At night, when the temperature is freezing, you go, you remove all of your clothing, you sit on the snow completely naked, and you pray, and you pray, and you pray. And you have to pray with your soul, not with your mind, not because you're curious. You have to kind of have this very intense and sincere longing and yearning within you. And you can kind of know whether you have those things by looking around you once in a while. If you see snow melting, then it means that you are sincere, on your quest. And so this kid wakes up at night and, goes outside and sits completely naked in the snow, and he begins to cry and he begins to pray. And miraculously, the snow around him and the ice around him is melting. And a few passerbys, look at the scenario and they run to the house of this, old man who had made the sarcastic comments, and they grab him. They all run towards where this kid is sitting, and they make this 12-year-old their teacher, And later on, he was called Baba Taher, which means father of purity. Mm. He has about maybe 90 to 120 poems. He's an introvert. His poems are filled with sadness and longing and yearning and, and I think there is a reason for it. Almost all of us in this room, have been in relationships, and you know how relationships start. You look at someone, and that looking creates an experience, and let's just say the experience is profoundly intense, and there is a good amount of attraction, and you just naturally gravitate towards that which gives you pleasure. And then you ask for his number or her number, and you guys go out, and 2-3 weeks, you're in love. And you do things that are humanly just impossible. You're constantly in the act of forgiveness. You're enormously patient. And you have this courage that all of a sudden it just comes about you. You want to spend time with your companion, so you call your boss and you say, I quit. Your defense for your dissertation is about in a couple of hours, and all of a sudden your man calls you, your woman calls you and says, you want to have dinner? I have to leave town for some business trip. And you have to kind of consider, am I going to miss my dissertation for being around this person, or should I just let her go and I'll just do my defense, get my PhD? And all of a sudden PhD becomes, it has zero value. You call the committee and you say, I don't think I can make it today. And you go, you have some dinner. And so, when your companion departs, you don't really know what to do with yourself. Something about you is broken, it's shattered. You long to be around them, but they're nowhere to be found. Or maybe, he or she has no place to go, so you guys go home together, you become roommates. And, the saying in the New Testament comes to be very true, that do not store your treasures down here, because this is a place where time exists. And anywhere where time exists has a tendency of slowly oxidizing whatever had, any glaze to it, any shine to it. It happens in every aspect of life. You buy a brand new piano, you take care of it. After a couple of weeks, you just dismiss it. It's not even there anymore. You buy a brand new car, you wash it every day. After a few days or a few weeks, you're no longer interested in washing it or keeping it clean. You go out with a man or a woman, you're in love. Time gets in. After a while, you'd say to him or her, why don't you go for a walk, leave me alone for a few hours, let me just be by myself. And I think one of the reasons why, his poems are filled with such sadness and sorrow is because, kind of like Gilgamesh, is fully aware that he is 2/3 God and 1/3 human, and that 1/3 has a tendency of getting in the way all the time. All the time. So And he tries, at least, in the way that he writes, to kind of always be on the path of remembering, not forgetting. And his poems are usually in the traditional music, Persian traditional music. It is perhaps the saddest section of, the traditional music. It really just, when you hear it, especially if someone can sing it the right way, you may be in a very, very happy and laughing mood, but all of a sudden, the moment you hear this, something about it just shatters, and all of a sudden this cloud hovers, above you, and you don't know how it came about, why it came about, but all of a sudden you realize that this way of singing Baba Taher, or any poet really, but in that particular section, just, it's kind of like, as he says in one of his poems, it's like a butcher. He kind of slices your soul away from your physical body, your flesh, and then your soul just sits there and has no idea what to do with the flesh or anything that's around it. So that's a little bit of an introduction to this man, that to some extent how rare these people really are. First you have to be really young and you have to be very, very innocent to believe in the most ridiculous things. Take off your clothes and sit in the middle of the snow and pray and cry, and God will reveal himself to you. If someone says that to me at my age, my mind is like a calculator now. It's scientific. I begin to do the pros and cons and find the speaker somewhat ridiculous. But if you're 5 or 10 or 12, you take everything that's face value. So یکی درد و یکی درمان پسندد. Yeki means someone. Dard is pain. Darman is remedy. Pasandad means desires. So to translate this first line, there's a person who desires sorrow. There is another person who desires its remedy or joy. یکی درد و یکی درمان پسندد. یکی وصل و یکی هجران پسندد. One person desires union. Another desires separation. The third line, من از درمان و درد و وصل و هجران. From these 4 options, sorrow, its remedy, union or separation, پسندم آنچه که جانان پسندد. I will accept whatever God gives me. If God wants to give me sorrow, I will accept it. If he wants to give me the remedy, I will accept it. If he wants to give me union, I will accept it. If he wants to give me separation, I will accept it. Earlier tonight you said, why don't I write something, start working on Baba Taher and making commentary. The problem with just writing commentary on this one single poem, 4 flimsy lines, Since Baba Taher comes from a very spiritual tradition, and because he himself is spiritual, he's not talking about the pain that has to do with your body. It's not about a toothache. It's not about having cancer. It's not about having a stomachache. So that particular pain that may cause sorrow is out. The next is, how about emotional pain? Well, most of our emotional pains and longings really have to do with the expectations of the things that we see, things we're attached to. You know, you have a boyfriend, you have a girlfriend, you have a sofa, you have a car, you have a body, and when these things become damaged or when they suffer an unpleasant experience, you have negative emotions. You know, but they're very much within the realm of the physicality, you know, and most of our troubles are that, you know, you know, money plays a very important part in life. If you don't have enough money, your rent is always in jeopardy. You know, you want to take your wife or your husband out to dinner, but you can't. That creates, you know, negative emotions. You go home and your wife or your husband, your companion looks at you strangely. All of a sudden you begin to doubt yourself and your relationship, you know. So I don't think Baba Taher speaks of that either. Though you can, you know, play with these ideas and insert them wherever you are in life. It doesn't really matter, because pain is pain. Then there is the intellectual, you know, pain. When you enter the mystical, the spiritual tradition, for the most part, you enter it because, you know, you've tried to find the solution to your existential crisis, and you just can't fix it. The mind, you know, can't travel that path. It can't reason itself to a solution. It doesn't work. So, you know, since he comes from this particular tradition, let's talk about pain, you know, sorrow. You know, your life is going good. You have a job, you have a husband, you have children or a wife, you know, you play the cello, you teach, whatever your life may be. And all of a sudden, you know, you have an experience. Maybe you walk into a classroom, maybe you turn on the TV on Sunday and there is this televangelist. Maybe you read a great book, maybe you listen to music. I don't know how these things happen, but all of a sudden, whatever the experience is, it makes your physical life, you know, to some extent irrelevant. It makes your history irrelevant. It makes, by history I mean your personal history, the sort of history that makes you attached to the tables and chairs of your life. You know, your car, your husband, your wife, your kids, boyfriend, girlfriend, job, money, all those things. You know, it's kind of like the story of, you know, the rich young man who runs into Jesus and says to him, you know, good master, I want to have eternal life. What do I do? And he says, okay, well, that's great. Go sell everything you have and come follow me. You know, the encounter initially is that I have all this money, but I'm not going to go drinking tonight. I'm not going to go smoking tonight. I'm not going to go watch a movie. I'm not going to go dancing with my friends. I'm not going to throw a party. Despite having all this money, my first encounter with this man named Jesus inspires me to go and follow him. You know, there's a good amount of conflict there. And Jesus is the embodiment of both union and separation. He kind of creates those doubts and certainties and longings and yearnings. He's like Costco. He gives you all these emotions and you have no idea what to do with them, you know. And he has a desire, but he doesn't really understand what it means to make that desire come to life. He wants that living voice or living spirit that lives inside Jesus. And he says, well, I want that. I want what you have. What do I need to do to have what lives inside you? And he says, well, the price of that is you have to give up your life, your physical life. And that for him is unacceptable. He just can't do it. He's not at that place just yet. Now imagine for a moment that the young man actually did go and sell everything that he had. And Jesus does give him an experience. The truth is, it doesn't matter how lofty the experience may be. Whoever lives in their flesh, whoever lives in society, whoever has a body, they have no choice but to suffer forgetfulness. And they have no choice but also to suffer feeling guilty for forgetting. Realizing all of a sudden that I've spent 5 hours watching a movie where I could have sat, maybe prayed, maybe cried, maybe meditated, maybe written, maybe read, maybe had a conversation with someone who can inspire certain parts of you. So there is a great amount of sorrow that lives inside you, and it's painful. And it is because you've had an experience, whatever it may have been, and it has created a big, kind of hole inside, and you have no idea what to do with it. It's kind of like what Rumi says, this is a path that is filled with blood. Your heart breaks all the time, and you don't know why. And that's all you see, blood all over you, and all around you, and it's nobody else's blood except your own, So when Baba Taher speaks of sorrow, you need to understand that in this sorrow there is an experience of union, there's an experience of joy, there's experience of sadness, there's experience of becoming aware and remembering, and there's also the experience of forgetting. Hating one's body, because it does cause you to kind of, to some extent, kind of steer off the path. I remember Hussein once told me that when I think he was 32 when he got married, that, he's a young man, he's 32, he just, had gotten married to this 20-year-old, and he says, for about 3-4 years I didn't do anything. It was just me and my wife going here, going there, having a good time with life. And after 3-4 years, he came to remember that yes, marriage isn't bad, traveling isn't bad, having a wife isn't bad, having fun isn't bad, but I'm saturated. Now it's enough. I want to go back to my roots, which is I want to go back to the sorrow that lived inside me, that inspired me to kind of read and write and think and go to certain gatherings. So he says though, yeki dardu, yeki dard pasandad, means there are certain people, there are certain temperaments, they never desire solutions. They don't want their problems to be resolved. They like sorrow. They enjoy sadness. It is through sadness that they feel connected. They don't like happiness. They don't like joy. They don't like union. And there are tons of stories in the Sufi literature where they really do talk about. Rumi talks about certain temperaments that they're just wired to be happy, and then there are certain temperaments that are wired to be sad. Baba Taher is one of those people who just enjoys being sad, I suppose. And in sadness he finds union. In sadness he finds meaning and purpose and relevance. These days my father and I, when we talk on the phone, Uh, he's a very good-natured man, being almost 90. And every time I say something that's slightly negative, he counters it with 1,001 positive things, And then when I hear him say those things, I say, okay, Dad, it's my turn now. Then I give him like 1,000,000 negative things. And then we kind of just sit there and on the phone, and he kind of laughs out loud. And for the past few months, we really have fun talking on the phone. But he is a sort of a fellow that enjoys optimism, enjoys happiness, enjoys joy, enjoys being positive. And me, on the other hand, enjoy kind of being sad and sorrowful, So before we move on to someone who seeks remedy, it takes a long, long while for anyone to kind of figure out and accept their do, their khamir, the music that lives inside them. Some people are just born to be introverted and to be sorrowful, but because they live, in society, because of parental discipline, because of peer pressure, they try to kind of change the way they are. And that creates a good amount of conflict until they get to a place in life where they say, you know what, this is my wiring, and I'm okay with it. So there's a good amount of maturity that's needed, all of us in this room, we teach in the classroom. And so you may walk into my class and say, well, he teaches this way, and maybe I should teach this way. And then you go to your own class and you realize, well, this is, the way you teach. This is your temperament. This is, the way that works for you. And, for the first few years, you kind of compare and contrast. I want to be like that person. I want to teach like that person. I want to sound like that person. And then with some maturity, and when you become relatively seasoned, you kind of come and you look yourself in the mirror and you say, you know what? This is just the way I am. This is the way I teach. I can scream. I can shout. Maybe sometimes I can use profanities, but not very often. I'm much more creative. I'm not as creative. And then you kind of just accept that and you move on,